They shamed her as a worthless slave until the quiet cowboy took her hand before everyone. Amara woke up before the sun had even risen. The cold wooden floor of the small room she called her own pressed against her back as she sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. The soft light of dawn was just beginning to seep through the thin curtains, painting faint lines on the walls. Outside, the rooster crowed, signaling the start of another day in the small town where she had lived for as long as she could remember. Every morning felt the same, early, exhausting and lonely. But she had learned to face it with quiet determination. She dressed quickly, pulling on the simple clothes that had become her uniform over the years. A plain dress worn at the edges from repeated washing, and sturdy shoes that had seen better days. There was no time to admire the sunrise or enjoy a moment of warmth. Chores waited. Her stomach growled, but there was no breakfast for her yet. She knew better than to think of herself first. The household she worked for ran like clockwork, and every task, from scrubbing floors to cleaning dishes, had to be done with precision. Amara stepped into the kitchen and began her work. The pots and pans were stacked haphazardly, the floor sticky from yesterday's spills, and the air smelled faintly of old bread and soap. She moved quickly, but quietly, as if her presence could somehow disturb the delicate balance of the house. The family she worked for, the Harpers, were kind enough in small ways, but their daughter Lydia was cruel and impatient, treating Amara as if she existed only to serve and be invisible. "Amara, hurry up!" Lydia shouted from the other room. "The floor isn't going to clean itself." Her words were sharp, cutting through the morning air like a whip. Amara's hands paused for a brief second, but only a second. She swallowed the lump in her throat and continued scrubbing, counting each movement like a mantra to keep herself steady. Every insult, every raised voice, had become a rhythm she knew by heart. She had learned long ago that arguing would only make things worse. The more quietly she endured, the smoother the day passed. Even the neighbors seemed to enjoy reminding her of her place. When she walked to the market to fetch supplies, children would giggle and point, whispering cruel things behind her back. "There goes the useless girl," one would say, making the others laugh. Adults would exchange glances, sometimes smiling politely, sometimes adding their own judgments under their breath. Amara had become invisible to most people and a target for ridicule to others. The weight of their disdain pressed down on her chest, making each step feel heavier than the last. Yet, despite the shame and exhaustion, Amara found small pockets of joy that belonged only to her. Sometimes it was the smell of freshly baked bread drifting from the bakery, reminding her of happier times with her family before life had become a constant struggle. Sometimes it was the sight of a bird perched on the fence, singing freely without a care in the world. These tiny moments were fleeting, but they gave her the strength to keep going, even when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. One afternoon, as she carried a heavy bucket of water from the well, her arms aching and her back sore, Amara noticed a boy standing at the edge of the field. He wasn't like the others who often stared at her with judgment. This boy, who she later learned was named Caleb, simply watched her. There was no mockery in his eyes, no whispering behind her back, just quiet attention. Amara felt a strange mix of curiosity and caution. Who was this boy who didn't laugh at her or call her names? The days that followed, she saw him more often. He moved around the town with a calm confidence, helping where he could without drawing attention to himself. Sometimes he would nod at her, a small gesture that felt enormous to someone who had been invisible for so long. At first, Amara didn't know what to make of it. She had learned not to trust easily, not to expect kindness from strangers. But there was something about Caleb that made her heart lift, even if just for a moment. Back at the Harper household, the cruelty continued, unabated. Lydia took every opportunity to belittle her, reminding Amara of all the ways she supposedly failed.
"Can't you do anything right?" Lydia demanded one morning, tossing a small pile of laundry onto the floor.
Amara's hand shook slightly as she picked up the garments, but she didn't reply. Speaking up only invited more scorn. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of her work, letting her mind drift to thoughts of freedom and dignity that felt distant, almost impossible. Amara's evenings were the hardest. After a long day of labor, when her body ached in every joint and muscle, She would return to her tiny room, often too tired to even sit. The loneliness was suffocating. There was no one to talk to, no one to share a kind word or a gentle smile. Yet she clung to hope in small ways. She would read scraps of old letters from her family, or imagine a day when people would see her for who she truly was, not just the servant she had been labeled as. One night, as she lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, Amara thought about the whispers she had heard throughout the day. Worthless, slave, nobody. The words were meant to wound, but she refused to let them define her entirely. Deep inside, beneath the layers of shame imposed by others, she knew she had strength, patience, and courage that no one could take away. Still, the weight of living under constant judgment was heavy, and sometimes, in the quiet of her room, she allowed herself to cry, letting the tears wash away the small pain that accumulated with every insult. Despite everything, life demanded she keep going. The town didn't stop, and neither did the Harpers. Every day was a test of endurance, a challenge to maintain her dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. But Amara had learned a lesson early in life. Resilience wasn't about being loud or angry. It was about surviving, quietly, without losing herself entirely. She had discovered the secret strength of those who endure silently, and while it didn't make her life easy, it gave her a quiet power that no one could see. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Amara took a moment to breathe. For a fleeting instant she felt almost free. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring the same chores, the same insults, and the same weight of judgment. But for now, in the fading light, she allowed herself a small spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, her life could change, and that someone might one day see her not as a servant, but as a person of value. And somewhere in the shadows of the town, though he didn't intervene yet, he noticed everything: the careful way she worked, the quiet dignity in her movements, and the resilience in her eyes. He knew there was something special about her, something others couldn't see because they were too busy judging. And even if Amara didn't know it yet, the first chapter of a new story, one where she might be recognized for her worth, was quietly beginning. The night grew dark, and Amara drifted into a restless sleep, her body aching but her heart carrying the fragile seed of hope. Tomorrow would be another day of trials, of whispers, and of invisible labor. But deep inside she held on to a truth that no one could take from her. She was more than the words people used to shame her. She was strong, she was patient, and her story was only beginning. The next morning Amara woke to the familiar sound of the rooster crowing. Her body ached from the previous day, but she forced herself to rise, as always. The chores never stopped, and the world seemed indifferent to her tiredness. She dressed quietly in her worn clothes and made her way to the kitchen, careful not to wake the Harpers before they needed her. She carried herself like someone invisible, a shadow moving through a house that never truly felt like her own. As she began cleaning the floors, she noticed movement outside the window. There, on the edge of the dusty lane, stood the boy she had glimpsed the day before. Caleb. He leaned casually against the wooden fence, hands tucked in his pockets, watching the sun rise. For a moment Amara froze, unsure whether he was looking at her or at something else. Then he gave a small, polite nod. There was no mocking smile, no cruel laugh, only calm, quiet attention. Her heart gave a little leap, though she quickly tried to push it aside. She was used to being unnoticed or laughed at, not acknowledged. The day continued as usual. Amara scrubbed, washed, and cooked with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years enduring criticism. Lydia's sharp tongue found its way to her repeatedly. "Amara, are you even trying?" Lydia demanded as she threw a pile of laundry onto the table. "I swear, you do everything wrong." Amara lowered her head, hands moving faster, working harder, but speaking none of the words she wanted to say. Complaining had never helped, and arguing only worsened the situation. She had learned that silence was safer, even if it made her invisible. Yet, through the routine and the cruelty, Amara felt a quiet warmth knowing that Caleb was there, somewhere, observing her without judgment. It was strange, but comforting. She began to notice him during other parts of the day as well, when she walked to fetch water from the well, or when she passed by the edge of the fields carrying bundles of vegetables. He was always at a distance, not intruding, just being present. That simple presence became a small comfort, a reminder that not everyone in the world was cruel. Curiosity began to grow in Amara. Who was this boy? Why did he seem to see her, really see her, in a way no one else did? She had spent her life being dismissed, humiliated, and overlooked. But Caleb was different. There was no rush, no expectation, only a quiet understanding that perhaps she was more than the chores she performed, and the insults she endured. One afternoon, as Amara carried a heavy basket of laundry back from the river, she stumbled slightly on the uneven path. Before she could regain her balance, a strong hand reached out and steadied her. She looked up and found Caleb standing there, his eyes filled with concern. "Careful," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. "That basket looks heavy." You shouldn't have to carry it alone. Amara's cheeks flushed with surprise. No one had ever offered her help without asking for something in return. She managed a small, hesitant smile. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't know why her voice felt so shaky, or why her heart beat faster than usual. Caleb didn't say much more. He helped her carry the basket to her small room, setting it down gently. Then he simply nodded and walked away, leaving her with a strange feeling she couldn't quite name. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just an act of kindness that made her feel seen. It was a small thing, but it meant more than she could explain. Days turned into weeks, and Caleb's quiet presence became a constant in Amara's life. He never intruded, never spoke when he wasn't needed, but he was always there. Sometimes he would help by fetching water, or carrying heavy bundles for her, or simply standing nearby while she worked. The townspeople continued their judgment, and Lydia never stopped mocking her. But with Caleb around, the sharpness of their words didn't cut as deeply. Amara began to feel a subtle shift inside her. She started to notice her own strength, the quiet endurance that had carried her through years of hardship. She realized that while others could try to define her worth, they could never take away her dignity. Caleb had not changed the world for her, but his recognition had given her a glimpse of something she had almost forgotten: that she mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Amara sat on the small wooden step outside her room, taking a brief rest after a long day. Caleb appeared, carrying a small bundle of firewood. He set it down carefully, not looking for praise or acknowledgement.
"You've been working too hard," he said simply.
"Take a moment for yourself."
Amara shook her head lightly. "I can't," she said softly.
"There's always more to do. The Harpers, they expect everything." Caleb knelt beside her, his expression gentle. "Even if they expect it, it doesn't mean you should forget yourself. You deserve a moment of peace, too."
Amara didn't reply immediately.
She had spent her life putting others first, hiding her feelings and bearing the weight of endless labor. But something in Caleb's words, in the quiet certainty of his voice, made her pause. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel that perhaps she didn't have to carry everything alone. In the following days, their silent companionship deepened. Amara began to notice small changes in herself. She felt less afraid to move through the town, even when the neighbors whispered or the children laughed. She began to carry herself with a little more confidence, a quiet strength that was entirely her own. Caleb never forced her to speak or explain herself. He simply acknowledged her presence, and that was enough to remind her that she was more than the insults she endured. One morning, as Amara worked in the fields collecting vegetables, she saw Caleb approaching. He carried a small bundle of freshly baked bread, something he had purchased from the market. "For you," he said simply, holding it out. "You've been working too hard, and I thought you could use a treat." Amara's eyes widened. No one had ever done something like this for her. She took the bread hesitantly, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded and walked back toward the fence, leaving her with a warmth that lingered long after he was gone. It wasn't just the acts of kindness that mattered. It was the consistency, the quiet reliability of Caleb's presence. Day after day, he reminded Amara that she wasn't invisible, that she wasn't worthless, that someone could see her strength and endurance even when the rest of the world ignored it. His silence was not emptiness. It was a steady support that allowed her to begin believing in herself again. Even Lydia's mockery began to feel less sharp. When the girl tried to belittle her, Amara would simply look away, remembering Caleb's calm, steady gaze and the small moments of acknowledgement he had given her. Slowly, she began to understand something important. Her value did not depend on the approval of others. It existed regardless of their words or actions. Amara also started noticing details she had ignored before. The way the sunlight caught the dust motes in the air, the faint scent of flowers in the market, the rhythm of the river as it flowed past the edge of the town. These small joys had always been there, but her mind had been too consumed with shame and exhaustion to see them. Now, with Caleb's quiet companionship, she began to appreciate the beauty in the ordinary. One afternoon, she caught herself smiling at a bird perched on a fence post, its song bright and clear. She realized she hadn't smiled like this in years. Not freely, not without fear of being mocked. That simple moment of happiness felt revolutionary. She didn't know if Caleb even noticed her smile, but it didn't matter. It was a reminder that her spirit could still find light, even in the shadows of hardship. As the days passed, Amara and Caleb continued to share a silent understanding. Words were not always necessary. Sometimes a look, a nod, or a small gesture conveyed everything that needed to be said. She felt less alone, more capable, and increasingly aware of her own worth. Caleb had not changed her life in dramatic ways, but his presence had begun to plant a seed of confidence and hope that would grow steadily over time. Amara had learned something powerful. Strength was not always loud, and courage did not always roar. Sometimes it was the quiet acts of recognition, the simple gestures of kindness, and the unwavering presence of someone who saw you for who you truly were that made the biggest difference. And for the first time in a long time, she began to believe that her story could be different, that she might one day be recognized, respected, and valued, not just by Caleb, but by the world around her. Evening fell and Amara prepared for bed, her body weary but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She thought of Caleb, of his quiet strength, and of the simple ways he had helped her see her own value. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, of trials, and of whispers from the townspeople. But now she knew she had an ally, a quiet friend who reminded her that she was more than the sum of the insults she endured. As she drifted into sleep, she felt a small, steady hope take root in her heart. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And in that quiet hope, Amara found the courage to face another day, knowing that she was not truly alone, and that perhaps the world might someday see her, as Caleb already did, strong, resilient, and worthy of respect. The morning sun rose slowly over the small town, spilling light over dusty streets and wooden fences. Amara woke as usual, her body sore from endless chores, but her mind carried a flicker of determination. She had begun to feel stronger lately, as if the quiet support of Caleb had given her a shield against the cruelty she faced. Still, some days were heavier than others, and today felt particularly heavy. She could sense that something was about to happen, though she did not yet know what. Her day began with the usual work, cleaning, washing, cooking, and running errands. Lydia's sharp tongue found her immediately, scolding her over small mistakes that anyone else would have ignored.
Amara!
"Is this how you sweep a floor?" Lydia snapped, pointing at a corner that had missed a tiny spot of dust. Amara lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly as she bent to clean it again. She had learned long ago that arguing would only make things worse. Silence had become her shield, endurance her weapon. Despite the harsh words and constant labor, Amara's thoughts occasionally drifted to Caleb. She remembered the small moments of kindness he had shown, helping her carry heavy loads, offering a nod or smile, quietly standing by as she worked. Those moments gave her strength, even in the darkest parts of her day. She realized that while she could not control the cruelty of others, she could hold on to the quiet hope that someone believed in her. That belief, even in small gestures, felt powerful. Later in the morning, the town began preparing for a public event, the annual Harvest Festival. The streets filled with townspeople decorating stalls, arranging produce, and setting up tables for games and contests. It was meant to be a day of celebration, but to Amara, it was another reminder of her position in the town. She had been tasked with fetching water, carrying supplies, and running errands for the festival organizers. Every step she took was met with judgmental glances or whispered remarks. Children pointed and laughed as she passed by. "There goes the worthless girl again," one shouted. Others giggled behind her back. Adults, too, whispered comments about her status, about the way she worked and the way she carried herself. Amara's chest tightened with each word, and for a moment she felt herself shrinking into invisibility. She wanted to cry, to shout, to run away, but she did neither. She had learned to endure, and she would endure today as well. Caleb appeared just as she was lifting a heavy basket of apples. He nodded at her, a simple gesture that made her heart lift slightly despite the tension around her. He offered to help, lifting the other side of the basket without a word. Together they carried it to the stall where the produce was being arranged. The work was exhausting, but having Caleb by her side made it feel lighter. His presence reminded her that she was not entirely alone in the world. As the festival began, the town gathered in the central square. Music played, laughter filled the air, and the smell of fresh bread and roasted vegetables spread through the streets. But amid the celebration, Amara could feel the judgment of the townspeople like a shadow that followed her everywhere. Some whispered cruel remarks about her clothing, her status, even the way she walked. She tried to keep her head down, focusing on her work, but it was impossible to ignore the sharp edges of their words. The tension built when Lydia, determined to make Amara the target of attention, decided to humiliate her publicly. Standing in the middle of the square, Lydia called out loudly, drawing the eyes of everyone present. "Come here," she demanded. Amara's heart sank as she approached, unsure what Lydia would do next. The crowd began to murmur, curious and eager to watch the unfolding scene. "Look at her," Lydia sneered, gesturing to Amara. "Doesn't she know she has no place here? A worthless servant thinking she belongs among decent people?" "Isn't that right?" The crowd laughed, some joining in mockery, some simply watching in stunned silence. Amara's cheeks burned with shame, and for the first time in a long while she felt the weight of her invisibility crush her completely. Every whispered insult, every judgmental stare, every moment of being overlooked had led to this moment. Amara tried to retreat, to shrink back into herself, but the square offered no escape. The laughter and cruel words surrounded her, echoing in her ears. Worthless. Slave. Nobody. Each word was a knife, cutting deeper than any physical blow could. She felt frozen, paralyzed by the sheer volume of cruelty directed at her. The townspeople seemed to take pleasure in watching her suffer, and the more she tried to remain invisible, the more they insisted on making her the center of attention. Amara's hands trembled, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of humiliation. Her chest ached, and tears blurred her vision. She had endured so much before, but this public shaming felt like the culmination of every insult and every whispered judgment she had ever faced. She wanted to vanish, to disappear from the eyes of the world, but there was no escape. And then, just when the moment felt unbearable, a movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. Caleb had stepped forward, his eyes fixed on her. He did not yell. He did not confront Lydia aggressively, and he did not speak to the crowd. He simply walked calmly toward her, his presence commanding attention without a single word. The laughter faltered as people noticed him moving steadily through the gathering. Caleb reached Amara and without hesitation took her hand. The simple act, holding her hand, steadying her, acknowledging her, sent a ripple of shock through the square. The cruel laughter faltered, replaced by stunned silence. No one had expected anyone to intervene, let alone in such a quiet, dignified way. The power of his gesture was undeniable. He did not yell at the crowd, Nor did he shame Lydia. He simply showed, in the most basic human way, that Amara was worthy of respect. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten. She mattered. For the first time in years, someone had stood beside her openly, without shame or mockery, and acknowledged her worth. The crowd watched, uncertain and silent, as the quiet cowboy and the girl he had recognized shared that simple, powerful moment. In that instant, something shifted. The cruelty that had defined her life in this town began to lose its grip. The whispers of the crowd slowed, and some faces reflected admiration rather than scorn. Amara felt her shoulders straighten, her heart lift, and a strength she had thought lost returning to her. She realized that the power to define her worth had never truly belonged to others. It had always been hers, waiting for someone to remind her of it. The rest of the festival faded into the background as Amara and Caleb stood together, hand in hand. The music and laughter continued, but the world seemed different somehow, brighter and less threatening. The cruelty of the townspeople no longer held the same weight. Amara understood that this moment would not erase all the hardships she had faced, but it marked a turning point. For the first time she felt seen, respected, and supported in a way that transcended words. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Amara walked beside Caleb through the quiet streets of the town. The festival continued behind them, but they were no longer part of its noise. They moved in a space defined by trust, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of one another's worth. Amara felt her heart swell with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and hope. She realized that life would still bring challenges, and the town would not instantly change its ways. But with Caleb by her side, she felt stronger than she had ever felt before. She could face the whispers, the laughter, and the judgment with a new sense of courage. She had been reminded that her value was not determined by the cruelty of others, but by her own resilience and the recognition of those who truly saw her. That night, as Amara lay in her small room, she replayed the day over and over in her mind. The humiliation of the morning had been terrible, almost unbearable. But Caleb's quiet intervention had transformed it into a moment of triumph. She understood that life would continue to challenge her, but she now carried with her the memory of that day, a memory that reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there was hope, there was strength, and there was the possibility of being seen for who she truly was. Sleep came slowly, but it came with a sense of peace she had not felt in years. The town could continue its judgment. The Harpers could continue their harsh expectations, but Amara no longer felt powerless. She had discovered that strength could come in quiet forms, that courage could be shown through simple gestures, and that one person's recognition could change everything. And somewhere nearby, Caleb watched over the town, quietly proud of the courage he had helped awaken in her. Neither of them spoke of it that night, but both understood that their lives had changed. The seed of hope had been planted, and it would grow steadily, carrying them forward into a future filled with possibility. The morning after the harvest festival, Amara woke feeling an unusual lightness in her chest. The shame and humiliation of the previous day still lingered, like shadows clinging to the corners of her room, but they were no longer as heavy as they had been. Instead, a new feeling had begun to take root, a quiet sense of strength, born from Caleb's simple act of holding her hand in front of the crowd. For the first time in years, she realized that someone truly saw her worth, and it changed everything. She dressed quickly, her worn dress feeling less like a uniform of shame and more like armor she had slowly built for herself. Every step she took to the kitchen felt different, lighter. The Harpers were already awake, bustling through the morning with their usual demands, but Amara moved with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. She smiled softly to herself as she scrubbed the floors, carried water, and arranged dishes. For the first time, she was aware of her own strength, her own dignity, and it gave her energy that no amount of labor could drain. Caleb appeared that morning at the edge of the yard, leaning casually against the fence as he often did. He nodded at her, and she returned the gesture, feeling a warmth she could not quite name. It was strange how much a simple nod could mean, how the quiet presence of another person could give someone the courage to face a day that might otherwise feel unbearable. She remembered the words he had spoken during the festival, the quiet reassurance in his gaze, and she felt a sense of safety she had never known before. As she went about her tasks, she noticed the townspeople looking at her differently. The whispers and judgmental glances were still there, but they no longer carried the same weight. Some of the children who had mocked her now avoided laughing in her presence, and even a few adults seemed to regard her with a new, cautious respect. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The world had not changed entirely, but Amara had. She had begun to see herself as worthy, and that change radiated outward, altering the way others perceived her. Caleb stepped closer as she lifted a heavy bucket of water, offering to carry it for her. "You've been working too hard," he said quietly, not as a criticism, but as a reminder that she did not have to bear everything alone. Amara felt her chest swell with gratitude, and for the first time she allowed herself to accept help without feeling ashamed. Together they carried the bucket to the garden, setting it down with care. "Thank you, Amara," said softly, looking up at him. I don't know why you always help me." Caleb smiled, a quiet, reassuring smile. "Because you deserve it," he replied simply. "You work hard, you endure so much, and no one should treat you as if you were less than anyone else. I see you." Those words echoed in Amara's mind long after he had walked away. They were simple words, but they carried immense weight. For so long she had been invisible, treated as if she had no value, and now someone had not only seen her, but had recognized her strength. It was a turning point, and she felt it deep within her. The following days brought new challenges, but Amara faced them with a quiet determination she had never known before. Lydia, still resentful from the festival incident, tried to belittle her again, but her words no longer pierced as deeply. Draven met them with silence or with a calm, steady gaze, and for the first time she realized that she could choose how to respond to cruelty. She could endure it without letting it define her, and that choice gave her a newfound power. Caleb continued to be a steady presence in her life. Sometimes he helped with physical tasks, sometimes he simply stood nearby while she worked, and sometimes he offered small gestures of kindness, a piece of bread, a shared joke, or a quiet smile. Each act reinforced the idea that she was not alone, that her worth was not defined by the harsh words of others. Slowly, Amara began to allow herself to hope that her life could be more than labor and humiliation. One afternoon, they walked together to the edge of the fields, carrying water for the crops. The sky was clear, and the sun cast a golden glow over the landscape. For a moment, they both paused, simply taking in the beauty of the day. Amara felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. Caleb turned to her, his eyes calm and steady. "You've been through so much," he said softly.
I wish no one had ever treated you that way, but you've shown strength that most people will never understand.
"Don't forget it." Amara nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I've always tried to be strong," she admitted, "but sometimes it feels like the world is too much to bear." "That's why you need to remember," Caleb said gently, "that strength isn't just about enduring alone. It's about accepting help, letting people see you, and allowing yourself to be recognized. You've done more than survive. You've grown stronger every day." His words stayed with her, and she began to see her own life through a new lens. She realized that her endurance, her patience, and her quiet determination had been her superpowers all along. No one could take that away from her, and now she had someone who reminded her of it every day. The town itself began to feel different as well. While some people still whispered cruel words, others began to treat her with more respect. She noticed small gestures of kindness from neighbors she had never expected. An offer to help carry water, a friendly greeting, or a small smile. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual shift that mirrored the change inside her. Amara understood that while the world might not always be fair, her perception of herself could shape the way others saw her. One evening, as they finished their work in the garden, Caleb suggested they sit for a moment by the river. The water flowed gently, reflecting the colors of the setting sun. Amara sank onto a smooth rock, feeling the tension in her body ease for the first time that day. Caleb sat beside her, not speaking, simply offering his presence. The silence was comforting, not awkward, and Amara felt a sense of connection she had never experienced before. "I never thought someone could see me like you do," she admitted quietly. "I've spent so long feeling invisible, like I don't matter. But you make me feel like I do." Caleb turned to her, his expression gentle and sincere. "You've always mattered," he said. "It just took time for the right people to notice. I see your strength, your patience, your heart, and I think the world will too if you allow it." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was not just gratitude, but a growing confidence in herself. She realized that recognition could be given, but worth had to be believed in. Caleb's belief in her sparked a belief she had buried deep inside. She was not just the laborer, the servant, the girl who endured. She was strong, capable, and deserving of respect. The days passed, and their bond grew quietly. Caleb did not push her, did not demand that she speak or act differently. He simply acknowledged her presence, her strength, and her humanity. Through him, Amara learned that support could be quiet but profound, that courage could be simple, and that change often came from small acts of recognition rather than grand gestures. As the season shifted toward autumn, Amara began to notice changes within herself that extended beyond the work she did or the treatment she received. She carried herself with more confidence, spoke more freely when necessary, and allowed herself moments of joy without guilt. She discovered that resilience was not just about enduring hardship, but about embracing the possibility of happiness, even in small doses. One crisp morning as they walked through the town together, Amara felt a quiet pride in the way she held herself. The whispers of judgment were still present, but they no longer defined her. She glanced at Caleb, who walked beside her with calm assurance, and she realized how much he had influenced her journey, not by changing her but by reminding her of the strength that had always been inside her. By the end of part 4, Amara had transformed in subtle but profound ways. She was no longer simply enduring her life. She was beginning to live it, to see herself as worthy, capable, and strong. The quiet bond she shared with Caleb had become a source of strength, hope, and courage, and though challenges remained, she now faced them with a resilience that could not be shaken by the cruelty of others. The world had not changed, but Amara had. And in that transformation, she found the courage to step forward into a future filled with possibility, guided by the quiet strength of the cowboy who had first taken her hand and reminded her of her worth. The days after the harvest festival passed quietly, yet they carried a new energy for Amara. She moved through the Harper household with a sense of purpose that had been absent before. The chores were still demanding, the tasks still endless, but they no longer defined her entirely. A quiet confidence had begun to grow inside her, nurtured by the simple, steady presence of Caleb. The boy who had first taken her hand in front of the entire town had done more than offer a gesture of courage. He had shown her that her worth could not be measured by the judgments of others. The townspeople, too, had begun to notice the change. Some of the whispers faded, replaced with cautious respect. A few neighbors who had once looked down on her offered small acts of kindness, a nod in greeting, an offer to help carry a heavy load, or a smile as they passed by. Even the children who had once mocked her began to hesitate, sensing that Amara no longer responded to cruelty with fear. She walked a little taller, held her head a little higher, and allowed herself to be seen as more than just a servant. Caleb continued to be a quiet presence in her life. He never demanded her attention, never asked for gratitude, and never tried to control her actions. He simply walked beside her, a steady reminder that someone truly understood her worth. When she carried heavy water buckets to the fields, he offered to help. When she completed exhausting chores in the kitchen, he brought a small piece of bread or fruit to remind her that she deserved care too. These simple gestures became a lifeline, a way for Amara to recognize that strength could exist alongside kindness. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Caleb paused and looked at her thoughtfully. "You've changed," he said gently. "Not because of me, but because you've begun to see what I've seen all along. You are strong, patient, and brave. You can face the world, and it will notice your courage, even if it takes time." Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest. I didn't think anyone could ever see me, she admitted softly. But now I feel like I can be myself without hiding all the time. You don't have to hide, Caleb said, and you never should. You deserve to be seen, to be recognized, and to be respected. The world will catch up, eventually. But for now, remember that your value has never depended on their approval. It's always been yours. Those words became a mantra in Amara's mind. She began to take small steps toward reclaiming her life. When the Harpers demanded tasks that were beyond reasonable, she no longer allowed herself to be crushed under their expectations. She found quiet ways to assert herself, finishing her chores efficiently, but without accepting insults or harsh words. The household still expected work, but Amara had discovered the difference between obedience and submission. She could perform her duties while maintaining her dignity, and she learned that this quiet assertion could not be ignored. The bond between Amara and Caleb grew stronger with each passing day. They shared silent walks along the edge of the fields, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the stillness together. Caleb's presence was never overwhelming, yet it carried a profound sense of safety and support. In him, Amara found someone who acknowledged her worth without judgment or expectation. And in recognizing her own strength, she began to imagine a future that had once seemed impossible, a life where she could pursue her own dreams, independent of the roles imposed upon her by others. One day, as Amara walked through the town carrying a basket of vegetables, she noticed the subtle shift in the way people looked at her. A merchant smiled kindly, offering her a small discount on supplies. A neighbor greeted her warmly instead of whispering judgments. Even Lydia's scornful glances seemed to carry less power, as if the girl had begun to realize that Amara's strength could not be diminished by mockery. Amara realized that change was not always dramatic. Often it came in small steps and shifts that began within oneself and slowly radiated outward. The turning point came one sunny afternoon, when the townspeople gathered for another small event, a local fair where everyone displayed their produce and crafts. Amara had been tasked with helping set up the stalls, but she no longer felt the fear or shame she once did. She moved confidently among the people, her head held high, her hands steady. The same crowd that had once laughed at her now watched with surprise and respect. She realized that her quiet courage had not gone unnoticed. People began to acknowledge her with nods and kind words, and for the first time she felt truly recognized as a capable, dignified young woman. Caleb was by her side as always, but this time he stepped back slightly, allowing her to receive the acknowledgement she deserved. He did not need to intervene. She had grown into her own strength. Amara noticed how different it felt to be recognized, not because of someone else's gesture, but because of the confidence she now carried herself. She smiled softly to herself, realizing that the courage she had found within had transformed the way the world saw her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara and Caleb walked along the riverbank. The sky was painted with gold and pink, and the water reflected the colors in gentle ripples. Amara felt a sense of peace and hope she had never known before. She reflected on how far she had come, from being humiliated and treated as worthless, to standing tall and being acknowledged for her strength. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "You've helped me see what I couldn't see before, that I matter and that my life can be more than work and shame." Caleb smiled, his eyes calm and warm. "I didn't give you that," he said gently. "You found it yourself. I only reminded you of what you've always had inside." Amara nodded, understanding the truth in his words. Her strength, her patience, her courage, they had always been part of her. Caleb had only helped her notice them, helping her recognize her own worth. It was a lesson she would carry forever. True empowerment comes from within, and recognition from others is meaningful only when it mirrors the belief one holds for oneself. In the weeks that followed, Amara began to take steps toward her dreams. She found joy in learning new skills, organizing small projects, and helping others in the town who faced challenges similar to her own. She discovered that her past hardships had given her empathy, patience, and insight that could be used to uplift others. With each small success, her confidence grew, and the town continued to acknowledge her not just for her work, but for the person she had become. Caleb remained by her side, a steady companion and friend. Their bond deepened, built on trust, mutual respect, and shared experiences. But Amara understood that her journey was her own. Caleb had offered support, encouragement, and recognition, but the courage, resilience, and transformation belonged to her. She had grown into her own strength, and that was something no one could ever take away. One afternoon, as they rested by the river after completing chores in the fields, Amara reflected on how far she had come. The weight of shame that had once crushed her no longer held power. The whispers of judgment no longer dictated her sense of self. She had discovered that her worth was not defined by others, but by her own courage, determination, and resilience. "I feel like I can finally breathe," she said softly, watching the water ripple in the sunlight. "I've learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. And it's not just about surviving, it's about living, truly living." Caleb nodded, smiling gently. "You've always had that strength. Now the world can see it too." The story of Amara's transformation spread quietly through the town. People began to treat her with respect, acknowledging her capabilities and her courage. She became a source of inspiration for others, showing that dignity, patience, and quiet courage could overcome even years of humiliation and neglect. The girl who had once been shamed as worthless now stood tall, recognized not only by Caleb but by the community she had once feared. By the time the first leaves of autumn began to fall, Amara's life had changed profoundly. She was still the same person in many ways, humble, hardworking, and patient, but she was no longer defined by the cruelty of others. She had discovered the power of self-respect, the strength and endurance, and the transformative effect of being truly seen by someone who cared. One evening, as they walked home from the fields, Amara looked at Caleb and smiled. "I've learned so much," she said softly. "I've learned that worth isn't given by others. It's found inside yourself. And I've learned that kindness and recognition can change everything." Caleb reached out and squeezed her hand gently, a quiet reminder of the bond that had helped her through the darkest times.
"And you've shown the world what true strength looks like," he said.
"Not through words or anger, but through courage, patience, and resilience. You've inspired more than you know." Amara felt a deep sense of peace and hope. She had endured hardship, faced humiliation, and been treated as if she had no value. But through it all, she had discovered her own strength, been recognized by someone who truly saw her, and finally begun to live as the person she was meant to be. Her journey had been long and difficult, but it had led her to a place of empowerment, dignity, and hope for the future. And as the sun set over the quiet town, casting long shadows over the fields and streets, Amara walked forward with a steady heart, knowing that she was no longer invisible, no longer defined by cruelty, and no longer bound by shame. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. And with Caleb by her side, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she could face them with courage, grace, and the quiet confidence of someone who had finally discovered their true worth.